Now comes the moment in this series, The Better MMO, where we actually talk about Endgame. Now, I've talked about the 5 major pillars, we'll say, of what I deem a good MMO should have. Good combat, a good class system, a good story, a great story if at all possible, great leveling experience, and a good endgame experience. Now, this is an interesting take because I don't have really any experience in Final Fantasy XIV's Endgame. However, I know someone who does. I know someone who has extensive experience in Final Fantasy, and I think it's worth having a conversation with. And that person is Galactic, who has been essentially my MS curator, person who convinced me to even play this game, and who has experience in Guild Wars 2 as well. So in this conversation of the better MMO, we are going to look at certain elements of both Final Fantasy XIV as well as Guild Wars 2, and see if we can discern an answer of which is the better MMO. In my experience, obviously playing Final Fantasy XIV and just having the knowledge of what type of game it has been compared to, all my years of raiding in World of Warcraft and all that, I've had the idea that a good majority of the people who play the endgame in Final Fantasy XIV, a good majority of them have the idea that it is essentially raiding, it is essentially trials, it's endgame grouped content. Now, it's not to say that that's the only thing that they can do. Of course, you know, in some of my conversations, people have gone ahead and done, we'll say, you know, like crafting. We have a whole crafting circle in the Discord as like that's their focus of endgame. That's something that they find enjoyment in. Then, of course, there's the glamour. Of course, there's the, you know, like I'm sure there's a PvP scene as well. So there's all these different areas and different choices that you can do once you get to endgame. But I've always held it in my mind that the major endgame for Final Fantasy XIV was, in fact, their grouped content, their raiding scene, their savages, you know, what have you. What are your thoughts to that statement?
A lot of that statement is probably from you listening to me talk about the game because I enjoy the rating aspect of it the most. There's a lot to it, and when you're like trying to look into what part of the population does it, it's also, which is about 20% for Savage. A lot of people are probably not even at endgame yet, because I know a lot of people do a bunch of different stuff, and also RP is pretty big in this game. I don't really do RP at all. It's not really my cup of tea, but I do know it is a large portion of it. And then there's also people that just do stuff casually. Endgame content that the devs make specifically, a lot of it is like normal raids, and then they have Savage and ultimates that they do. Endgame is generally there's stuff for crafting, and then a more mid-course type thing, which actually we had in Stormblood and Shadowbringers. We did not have it in Endwalker, and it was actually, its absence was heavily felt. And it's a exploratory zone where basically new zones. Eureka had 4 zones, Baja had 2, and then also like a 48-man raid instance for Savage, and then 24-man for normal, which you'd do the normal one for the story of that. But the general premise is you go in there, fight enemies, do basically boss fates, like a bunch of boss fates. And at the end, for Eureka, at the very end, there was the Baldassian Arsenal. I forget the term for it, because it's been a while since I've been in Baja, but it was like my favorite. Baja overall was like my favorite content in Shadowbringers. And it was like done in the same way that they kind of did the fates, and there was like several bosses, and it's like an instant. It's not when you eventually get to it. I want to have you do Baja, because Baja is very fun, and you'll see it when you get to that. They didn't have that in Endwalker, but they're going to be having a Baja / Eureka type content in Dawntrail here. For crafting, they actually kind of started a thing with in Shadowbringers, whereas the Ishgard Restoration, you won't be able to really see how it was progressed because it was like its server side, and so you can actually go to where it's finished, which is the Firmament, and that's also what the Ishgard housing district has also become. And that was like heavily crafting content. Like different servers would actually be like first, depending on how many crafters they had crafting stuff in it. Something that was kind of along the lines of that, but it was also a bit more casual and solo, and that was Island Sanctuary. You'll see what that is when you get there, because it's something you could do a little bit of it, but that was also a bit of a grind to get to max. Players that come in later can still like progress through it and not just be there and like, oh, but it's finished. And then there's just like fates. Then there's like treasure maps and a bunch of other stuff that you can do if you're not really into crafting or high-end content. And then also RP, like I mentioned before.
So there's, I mean, kind of the same idea of what I've like imagined and kind of compared against like Guild Wars 2. They have very similar pillars I kind of jokingly coined the term of pillars of endgame for Guild Wars 2. So you have PvE, you have your strike missions, and then your raiding, and then it's like your casual open world stuff. Like, I mean, there's these different levels of things that you can do. However, from my point of view, I've always kind of viewed it to be, well, Final Fantasy to be kind of like your typical MMO, like your typical MMO that has the various amounts of endgame content that you can really spend your time in. Seeing as I think that I'm kind of the same vein as you, probably not as dedicated, I'll be the first one to admit, as far as looking at endgame grouped content, so raid, strike, savage, you know, all the raids, I said strike missions, raids, trials, savages, and stuff like that. In just like one sentence, how would you describe endgame for Final Fantasy XIV?
Obviously, Guild Wars doesn't have, like, Guild Wars does gear differently, where it's like horizontal. 14 has like more vertical, but can't really. It's very easy to get caught up because it's either, if you're not raiding, it doesn't matter what gear you have, and if you're raiding, you can very easily just get caught up by like getting on, and then you can get the crafted gear very easily, and that crafted gear is the baseline for basically every fight except ultimate. No fight will require a higher item level than you can get with crafted gear, except for, like I said, ultimates. If you're wanting to just jump into raiding, and then in raiding you'll get raid gear and other stuff. But yeah, I'd say it's very easy to hop in and out, and depending on like how hard in the game you're wanting to go, like if you're wanting to get into raiding, there's a little bit more to it, but like gear is not really an issue in this game at all.
Now, speaking of that, how difficult would you say it is to get involved into raiding and that scene, like finding a static, we'll say?
Yes and no. I'd say finding a very good static that you can like stick in long term is a bit of luck. I like how I am in my static kind of determines, like, depends on what you're looking for in a static, like how much you're wanting to raid, how like what the mindset you're looking for in the raid in the static is. There's like a bunch of nuances to it. Getting into it, there is a bit of, I'd say, a little bit of a barrier to entry, but the gap between casual and then getting higher into the game it's a bit of a jump from casual to even just extremes. The game doesn't do really the best job at teaching you how to play your class properly and other things. You can pretty much get through the whole game with like barely knowing how to play your class, and it shows when you do dungeon roulette sometimes with some people. It's not hard if you like apply yourself and you're like, I want to learn how to play my job, and then get better and get into extremes. But that's something you have to like learn, and also go to some outside resources if you want to learn how to play your class 100% optimally.
Well, I mean, I think I have a good enough picture of the end game. Is there any other things that you would like to like comment or say about the end game in Final Fantasy?
Bit that I played Guild Wars 2. Granted, I haven't gotten to like the hardest like raids and strikes that they had there because I've got stuck into 14. But from what I've done with you and then Astral and some other people, 14's raid content is so much better.
And I had a feeling you were going to say that, and I honestly don't disagree with you. However, there is a lot more to Guild Wars 2 than just their raiding content and their grouped content.
Yeah, I know, like, very much. Guild Wars 2's strongest point is its open world. The world bosses that are chained in with the events.
Yeah, so without a doubt, Guild Wars 2, in my opinion, is their greatest strength and the greatest asset. And it's actually one of the things I talked about in the leveling video is, in fact, their open world. Their open world is unmatched by any game that I have found. And you kind of hinted at it, specifically talking about like the open world bosses. The open world bosses not only are like fun, it just feels like this huge community comes together to pull off this task. Now, depending on what time that world boss is, you might not get enough people, because that is a thing. You will need enough people to be able to take down the boss, because they do have mechanics that require you to, kill, three, the jungle worms require you to kill all three at the same time, or like within quick succession. Have enough, we'll say, supports to take down the or to protect certain things. Like I'm thinking like Tequatl. Like there's these different elements that make the dynamic open world so much better.
The term came to me. The meta events in Guild Wars 2 in the open world. Like, that's Guild Wars 2's strong point, and the point that they are very much focused on when they make the stuff, make new content. They focus on their maps and then the map meta events.
And of course, Guild Wars 2 does have other endgame contents, as we have talked about it. They have raids, which are a part of it and have been for quite a while, since I believe the first raid was the Heart of Thorns expansion. And they were really trying to find themselves. I think that, and the joke has always been like Wing 8. They've been waiting for Wing 8, which is apparently coming out with Janthier Wilds. The fights themselves seem like they're important, and the very few that I've done, and I won't sit here and say that I've done all the different raids, but I have raided before. It's not that it's not easy. It's not that it's, you know, an absolute cakewalk, but it's fairly predictable. And if you have a group of players who know what they're doing and are having with the correct builds, I mean, things go fairly smoothly. Conversely, talking about how you mentioned with Final Fantasy XIV, it's like, oh, you get into some duties and there's like a duty roulette and you could tell who doesn't know how to play their class. It's very similar with what you would expect in Guild Wars 2. That also goes to say very similar to what you were talking about with Final Fantasy, is that you have to go to outside resources to really know what to do and what the optimal rotation. It's the same thing here with Guild Wars 2. It's very much geared towards the casual, and honestly, you can clear most of the story and a lot of different lower instances, like lower level fractals, with very little game knowledge and your build being a wonky donk. And that's always been, you know, kind of the way with Guild Wars 2. But I will say that the raiding scene is there. It just also feels kind of like more difficult to get into than I would imagine that it is for Final Fantasy XIV. One good thing, and you kind of hit on it, is the idea of horizontal progression. That is one thing that I've always thought Guild Wars 2 does very well with Endgame. Instead of stacking all the way up to, you know, the highest item level, the highest gear level to push the highest endgame content, for the most part, you can purchase what's exotic gear, which is on the auction house. You can get exotic gear from a lot of places and you'll be fine. The idea of the horizontal progression is that you never you never lose your spot. So even going into Janthier Wilds, if you have even ascended gear, which is better than the exotic, you're going to be set up for whatever Janthier Wilds has to throw at you, you know? How successful you are at endgame. And I will say for PvE as well as PvP, because PvP we haven't even really touched on. That's a big endgame part in Guild Wars 2. However, the PvP is accessible at like level 2. Like you just have to finish the base tutorial and you're able to PvP. And for whatever your class, whatever profession that you're playing, and whatever you have on your account, including the elite specializations. You don't have to unlock them to be able to play it in PvP. I will say that the experience for Guild Wars 2 is, in a whole, it is very casual compared to what I would say for Final Fantasy. Of course, now with Final Fantasy, you are paying a monthly sub, but that also has like its certain perks, and you have like a well-maintenance game and all that. And it's not to throw any shade at Guild Wars 2 or anything. However, Guild Wars 2 is a very casual-oriented play. And I mentioned the horizontal progression. If you play in Guild Wars 2 now, like you're essentially set. Like if you get a legendary piece of gear, you'll never need another piece of gear for that particular slot ever again on all of your characters. So it kind of removes the necessity of like the constantly grinding and the seasonal grind for gear for the long-term effort for that piece of gear, and then you're good to go. And that's also something very important to we'll say the Guild Wars 2 community, is the legendary grinding. That's a very big piece of endgame, because essentially it's like you're working for the convenience of that particular piece, whether it be weapon, armor, you know, trinkets, amulets, all that stuff. But I think that's kind of the point of what Guild Wars 2 does. Guild Wars 2 is very, very casual oriented, and it's kind of like, hey, pick us up and play when you want to and put us down when you need to. That's why there's no sub. I mean, that's something to be said.
I would also say 14 is a decently casual leaning, though it does also have like Savage and Ultimates for those that are more hardcore want like the raid experience. My experience first off, when I was getting into Guild Wars, trying to get into Guild Wars 2 raiding a little bit before I touched 14 and got sucked in, and before I met you, because I don't think you were even actually actively playing Guild Wars 2 at that time. I was like looking into it, and it's like it's either you're out of luck or you need 99 kills to join most groups. For I want 99 proof of kill on this one boss for you to join this group, because I want this to be fast. Getting into it being new. In 14 though, they have like actually categories you set up as like learning or practice, and people will. My experience with that with Savage is not so much because I've had statics most of the time, but like extremes, especially with like if it's like current expansion, put up a learning party, you will get people that will join and help you out. As for PvP, I know PvP is a bit bigger in Guild Wars 2. PvP in 14, there is a community with it. PvP is more of like it's there. So with that, PvP is, I'd say, at least casually, has gotten a bit more people doing it. Without also the new rank system that came out, it was popping off at first, but then the awards is kind of the same thing except a different number, so it kind of fell off a little bit for most people, though there are still people that do it. But overall, yeah, PvP it's not nearly as big as like other casual stuff or raiding.
I'll let you speak on it first, and then I'll have my piece. But which MMO does Endgame better?
That kind of depends on what you're looking for. My bias is I would say 14. For open world stuff, probably Guild Wars 2. But for like everything else, like crafting, RP, and raiding, I would say 14 does it a lot better.
I actually had a very similar answer. I was going to say it's kind of not even really a comparison, because I don't believe that Final Fantasy XIV and Guild Wars 2 are necessarily targeting the same kind of audience. Like, Guild Wars 2, of course, has these other MMO elements, but as you mentioned, the open world and is like one of its biggest features. And of course, the casual mentality, and I really stress the casual mentality with Guild Wars 2, especially non-financial committing casual gameplay, is huge. Having said that, if you wanted more of the raiding experience, the RP experience, the story experience, then I would of course recommend Final Fantasy XIV. So I can't necessarily say one is better than the other. It's kind of like, what do you want to spend your time more on? Like, do you like creating custom builds and these wacky, like, character things? Then Guild Wars 2 might be your way. Or do you perhaps really like to push hardcore endgame and have something that's going to challenge you for the next like 6 months to a year? Final Fantasy is probably going to be your best bet.
Also PvP, probably Guild Wars 2. I just, from what I know of PvP in Guild Wars 2 versus 14, is PvP, it's probably, if you're a PvP MMO or an MMO player that enjoys the PvP aspect, it's probably Guild Wars 2 more so.
I'd agree with that. And also something that we didn't even really touch on is World versus World for Guild Wars 2, which is a secondary PvP mode where it's essentially, and I've always quoted it as such, as the Wild West of PvP. Essentially, it's a PvPvE kind of experience, because there's NPCs that you have to kill. You have to be able to take down towers, castles, and capture them so that your team gets more points. But there's massive Zerg things that are going on where it's these large groups, contingents of players who are all standing on top of each other to share buffs and to attack the other, we'll say, Zerg. So there's, with PvP, I will definitely give the lead to Guild Wars 2, because I think it's a little bit more action oriented. Of course, even with like just built in the dodge roll and then the weapon swapping, I really feel like that leads into the combat being a lot more PvP oriented. Now, this is also me not speaking or being able to play, we'll say, Final Fantasy's PvP. I do think that it just really falls down to whatever one, as you said, whatever one you think is going to be more interesting. This is a tie, because there is no right answer. It depends on the player. While I do think that both MMOs have their merits, it really is just going to boil down to which one of these MMOs piques your interest the most. If you're going to be working in towards the end game, that usually means that you're going to commit quite a bit of time into the game to see what it can do and eventually get to that point. And if you're looking at it in that regard, some research might need to be done to see if that's even something that you want to work towards. However, I will also make mention that part of the MMO experience is actually just playing to Endgame and playing through the main story and leveling up your character and gaining power as you go. That is a very, very important part of the MMO, and I feel like it's one that's commonly overlooked. So, having said that, no, there is no better MMO's Endgame. It really depends on what you deem fit worthy of your time. Now, I did talk about the leveling experience, and as I've just hinted, it is very, very important. You can see that video here, where I compare the two different elements between Final Fantasy as well as Guild Wars 2. Aside from that, stay caffeinated, folks.